Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa. Welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from all over the world. And just want to mention that today is also, celebrated the Mass this morning, but today is also a feast for Jesuits. It is Mary, Mother of the Society of Jesus, and we celebrated that today with great delight. And it's an important part that not only Jesuits, but every priest and every Christian really benefits from having that kind of devotion to the Blessed Mother. And Jesuits celebrate that especially today because it's the anniversary of St. Ignatius and the first Jesuits taking their final vows back in 1541. But as we always do, we bring you some guests, and instead of going from all over the world, we are going from coast to coast. We have folks from both the East and the West Coast to talk with us about what had been a very long discredited economic philosophy of socialism that happens to be making a comeback in American society on college campuses because they're young and they just are exploring thought, but also political talk shows and in political debates among politicians and also among very sincere and fine Catholics who are trying to think through the economic needs of the 21st century. So today what we have is joining us via Skype, all the way from the White Mountains of the small yet great state of New Hampshire, is Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, who is an assistant professor of social research and economic thought at the Catholic University of America's Bush School of Business. And from the West Coast, joining us via Skype, all the way from totally San Diego, California, is Trent Horn, who is a staff apologist with Catholic Answers, as well as an adjunct professor of apologetics at Holy Apostles College. Together, they have written a brand new book, a great book I was able to read, called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? And it's got a subtitle in brackets. The answer is no, and here's why. So I'd like to welcome Catherine Pakaluk and Trent Horn. Welcome to our show. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Father.
Good to have you. And let's start off with a little bit. Why did you two write this book? What was your interest in coming up with this?
Well, I was proposed the idea to write this book by a group of supporters at Catholic Answers. And I had seen and was concerned about the rise of socialism among my peer group, for example, among millennials, and even many other people, as you talked about in political discourse and other things like that. So I was concerned about many Catholics, people who are faithful or otherwise Orthodox Catholics, saying maybe we should give socialism a try. And I'm thinking, do you not remember the church's teaching on this for 150 years? So I felt compelled to write the book on this subject, but I knew I couldn't do it alone, especially that people would discredit me and say, well, what do you know about all these economic issues? So I wanted to seek out a solid Catholic economist who could partner with me so we could address this issue in an interdisciplinary way. And as I sought advice from others, Catherine's name was number one on my list, and I was very grateful that we were on the same wavelength on a lot of these issues, and the collaboration put forward, I think, a good resource for people.
Now, Catherine, what exactly motivated you to follow this gentleman's lead in this book? Why would you, as a young professor, be interested in engaging in this kind of research and writing?
Well, it's a great question. There's almost no abuse you can take that's worse than writing on this question, economist or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's actually hard to find people who will speak out on it. But why did I respond to Trent? I had just finished writing a book chapter in which I had gone through all of the papal encyclicals and tried to tease out all of the things that had been said. And this was published, and it was, stuck in a big thick book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so convicted about the fact that the church has been so clear, and yet starting in the 2016 election, we've been hearing more and more about socialism. And I thought people need to know this.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that I think is very important, because as you say, 150 years of church teaching has criticized socialism and communism. As a matter of fact, you make a great point in the book about the difference between the two. What is the difference between socialism and communism?
Well, it's difficult in the literature to tease it out exactly. And in fact, some critics of our book, that's one of the boilerplate criticisms, is people will say, well, you misunderstand the difference between socialism and communism. A lot of people mistakenly think that the difference is that socialism is peaceful and benevolent and communism is authoritarian. But that's not the difference. You can have peaceful communes, and there have been authoritarian socialist regimes. Rather, both socialism and communism, as we discussed in the book, are terms that are often used interchangeably to refer to the same centrally planned economies where the means of production, those things that produce wealth and goods and services, are communally owned. And of course, usually what that means communally owned is that they're owned by the state, and then those resources are distributed as such. Among Marxist socialists, those who follow Karl Marx, they would say communism is an end goal where there are no classes, no rich, no poor, no employers, no employees. Everyone is equal, which Pope Leo XIII said illicitly took society down to one dead level. So socialism is a means to get to communism eventually, where the state enforces this kind of equality. So you still have classes, you have the state and citizens, but it's supposed to be an end goal to this equality that never actually materializes.
As I recall, Karl Marx had seen the existence of the state as a temporary institution. Eventually, the state would no longer be needed, and that the proletariat would itself run everything without a state government. That was his ultimate hope.
Yes, his collaborator, Frederick Engels, once said that the idea of the state, that as these ideas of social classes, quote, fall as they once rose, the state inevitably falls with them. He said the idea of a governing state or country should, quote, belong in the Museum of Antiquities next to the spinning wheel and the bronze axe.
And of course, they also were even more strongly against religion. That was the opiate. I remember in Marx's dissertation on in 1847, that's where he first had written, I believe, that religion is the opiate of the people.
That's right. And as we show in the book, there's always been a clash between socialists, true socialists, and true Christians. And I think, and I'm sure Catherine can speak well to this also, I think the essence of the clash is that true socialists believe that heaven is something you can make on earth, and human beings are good at heart. And so if you change society, you could make heaven on earth. But true Christians believe that heaven is not of this world, and we, because of original sin, can never make heaven on earth. We should strive to make a just world, but we can't create a socialist utopia.
I remember, I've said many times in lectures, when people complain that the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was not defined until the 1850s. And people say, well, why is it so late if it's such an important dogma? And I said, well, they didn't really need to have it defined earlier. People believed it already. But in the 1800s, you had people like Marx and a number of other philosophers who believed that everybody was immaculately conceived, and there was no such thing as original sin. And the church finally had to say, no, only one of us was immaculately conceived. Everybody else is a sinner, and we have to deal with that reality. And that was a counteraction to some of these philosophies that denied the sinfulness of the human race.
Agreed.
Now, the other thing too, Catherine, you have been doing a good deal of study on the papal teaching, the teaching by the papacy against socialism has been fairly consistent. But in the 1800s, the criticism seems to have been mostly on the basis of theory. But then in the 1920s and 30s, when socialism is made the economic theory of Soviet Union and eventually of Nazi Germany, then it becomes a criticism of the actual. Why would the popes already criticize the theory of socialism before it was actually undertaken in practicality?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think this falls under the heading of the church's claim to being an expert on human nature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she has some sort of insight into how that we're built, how God invited us to take care of the environment. So it's like the popes in the 1800s are saying, you know, this isn't going to work out well.
Mm-hmm.
It just can't work out well.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly prophetic, but it's also tragic.
Mm-hmm.
So contained in Pope Leo's writings have marvelous defense of private property,
Mm-hmm.
not merely as an individual right, but as an individual duty, an obligation to God, to others, but most importantly, as a family right. So the Pope saw that actually, if you undermine the right to private property, you undermine the ability of fathers to provide for their family.
Mm-hmm.
And that forms really a very critical part of Pope Leo's prophecy. There's a very touching brief sentence in Centesimus Annus when the Polish Pope, who looked back on that socialism in practice, says something like, we might regret that the world did not pay closer attention to Pope Leo. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's stunning. It's a stunning comment for the Pope who grew up under those terrible things to look back and say, why didn't we pay attention to the church?
Mm-hmm. Well, something else, because it's in one sense not only papal teaching, but I think as you point out in the book, I'm not sure which one contributed this part of the book, but you mention how an experiment in socialism was done in this country, in what became the United States, back in the 1620s with the Pilgrims. A lot of folks don't realize that they were also experimenting with socialism. How did socialism work out for the Pilgrims?
Not very well. So what happened with the Pilgrim colonies was that they tried communal food production. So all the food was grown in one kind of central plot, or well, people would actually grow food, and then it was collected and stored in a centralized way, and then rations would be distributed to people on an equal basis. No matter how much food you grew, you always received the same rations. But very soon, people began to complain about this. Wives said that they felt like they were slaves to other people's husbands. Even the elderly who got more food than they normally would felt like that was unjust, and they didn't like the system. But along with those complaints, the more catastrophic thing was that food production plummeted, because when people saw that they got the same amount of rations no matter how much food they grew, they lost their incentive to try to grow a lot of food, and they faced famines in 1620 and 1621 because of this. So the governor, William Bradford, said, we thought we were wiser than God, and we were wrong. So God showed us a better way, and he said each of the families was assigned their own communal plot of land. They were allowed to keep what they grew, and he said because of this, food production multiplied. And these same experiments take place every day. I mean, if you think about it, back when you used to still be able to go to a public park, of course, the analogy doesn't work as well now. But when you could go to a public park, what bathroom is cleaner, the one at your house or the one at the public park? The one that everyone uses but nobody owns is going to be mistreated more than the one that somebody has ownership over and wants to care for. So that's the essence of private property, and why the church affirms it not as some kind of unlimited absolute right, but something that is a good we have a right to, that ultimately contributes to the well-being of people and families.
Can I add a
please.
small thing here?
Please.
People tend to talk about socialism in optimistic terms when they think about dividing all the benefits. Kind of, there's all this good stuff out there, and shouldn't we all have an equal share? The real problem, which is what the Pope saw and the Pilgrims saw, is actually the problem in society is how to get people to do work, right? Who's going to do the backbreaking work in the field? Who's going to take the risk to start a business? That's actually the hard thing. Or to Trent's point, who's going to clean the toilet? So that's the prior problem that socialism can't solve for us.
Yeah, and it's not only that some jobs are more easy to do than others. Some are really difficult. I remember there was a television show called Dirty Jobs, and it was part of the attraction of the show is that the host was showing people the kind of really nasty work that some people do that we take for granted. And we have no idea how gross it is. And he showed us. But he did so with a sense of respect for the people who did those jobs, and an appreciation that it makes sense to pay these people more money than somebody who has an easier job, as a way to motivate them to do something, as well as put up with this, very nasty experience of cleaning a lot of stuff that you wish weren't dirty in the first place.
And that's the problem of motivation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Catherine.
If the property system doesn't work to provide incentives for people to do these jobs, then somebody has to force people to do them.
Yeah.
Right, and that's the point that I wanted to add, is that when we look at how people are compensated for things, another way to talk about the difference between socialism and capitalism is the idea of how are prices set. In a free market economy, prices are set through free exchanges. Producers can set a price, and the price is either approved by the consumers through a purchase, or it is not approved, and the producer has to either lower it or raise it accordingly. And so wages are something that is similar in that respect, in that the wage for the price of labor is something that you freely enter into. So when you it's kind of funny. I remember an anecdote about a plumber. and the plumber comes and a guy's pipe is busted and leaking, and he comes in and he spends 2 minutes and fixes it, and he gives, here's a $100 bill. And the guy says, I paid you $100 for 2 minutes of work. And the plumber says, no, you paid me $100 for 20 years of knowledge and experience to know how to fix these things in 2 minutes. Yeah. So people are unequal. As we talk about in the book, in talents and abilities and skills, they're equal in dignity and basic rights. So socialism is right that we ought to have equal rights and basic dignity, but it's wrong in thinking that things like wages or income or wealth should be distributed evenly, because as Pope Leo XIII says, there is an inequality in talents and skills and application, and that's going to be rewarded differently. For example, it would be a crime for you to pay me the salary LeBron James makes to play basketball. To pay me that amount would be a crime because I'm terrible at it, But whereas LeBron James maybe shouldn't be paid, he may not be as good at making a basketball as he is playing basketball. So we talk in the book how this genuine human interdependence is something that flourishes. It flourishes in other settings, but it's stamped out in socialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things, too, that I have to say at the outset is that, when I was myself in college, I was very much someone who I thought socialism made sense. There is a logical element to the socialist theory that says, well, let's just have one person organize this. You get rid of redundancies. You have everybody doing what they're supposed to do, and you save money on advertising and all that kind of stuff. But, there were a number of socialist adults in my family. They were also in favor of socialism. So it made sense to me. But there is nothing like a trip to Eastern Europe to give you another sense. Back in the communist days, I was able to visit Eastern Europe, and also Peru, where there were socialists. I met socialists, communists, the military dictators who were also socialist. Lots of back in Peru and back in those days, in the 70s. And after meeting the various socialist parties, I came away with this sense of not trusting any of them. They were all in it for themselves as politicians. And then when I saw socialism in Poland back in the 70s, before communism fell, I saw the lines. There were about 6 links of sausage in a store, and the line was out and down the block for the sausage by 7 a.m. They were standing in that line for those few sausages. Or the store in my family's village. There in the whole store, there were 2 loaves of bread. And the reason they had so much bread is they were made by the villagers. They were selling them to somebody else. But it was, I saw this is an awful system. And it was not working at all.
Yeah, if you look at it now, when you compare, if you don't like there being shortages at the store, if you've noticed that now, that's how it's like in socialist countries all the time. What's interesting is that what we're experiencing now is that there were temporary shortages in certain items at the store, but because we live in a free market society, and Catherine can speak to this probably better than I can, consumers and producers are able to respond in a quicker feedback loop to meet that unusual increase in demand. But in socialist countries, when a central planner tries to say, okay, well, here's how much bread we're going to make, here's how many nails we're going to make, we're going to try to plan out the whole economy, what ends up happening is you overproduce goods that people don't want, and you underproduce the things that they really do want, and leads to these shortages, such as during, and we talk about in the book how This happened in the Soviet Union, happened in North Korea, in Cuba even. They had shortages of goods that they domestically produced, not even things that they were cut off by an embargo. Even normal foodstuffs they would domestically produce, they experienced severe shortages of, and to this day have to resort to black market activities to be able to procure them.
Yep. Yep. Catherine, did you want to address that?
No, I think that Trent's point is excellent, that we are kind of getting a little bit of a window into what happens when we don't allow these things to work the way that they can. Lovely for us that these things do work. There was actually a funny example of a bunch of economists recently who circulated a petition to prevent these laws against so-called price gouging on the grounds. It sounds very mean and nasty, but it's on the grounds that the spikes in prices allow the market suppliers to figure out this is where we need toilet paper or whatever else it is that we have shortage. I don't know that it got a lot of traction because people still view this kind of price spike in a crisis as an immoral situation.
But what's interesting, though, is that stores, in order to allow people to meet goods, they have quote unquote, well, they've manipulated prices or purchasing ability. So normally if you increased prices, it would help slow down demand. One thing that they've done, we've seen, is that they simply limit purchases. You can only get one roll of toilet paper. And so when people are freely able to interact with one another, they can achieve this kind of equilibrium. I will say, Father, it has been interesting in this pandemic and what is happening, seeing more people argue for socialism straight up from the conditions. I've seen people say online that people are worried about going back to work, about catching this disease, and others replying to them saying, well, why should anyone have to go to work? No one should have to work if they don't want to. If they don't want to work, they should be able to make a living without working. And that's been the dream socialists have always proposed, that somehow we can arrange the economy so that if people don't want to work, they don't have to. And if you remember that congressional proposal for the Green New Deal that was proposed several years ago, talked about benefits for people who can't work and do not desire to work, which led to the proposal quickly being taken off that congressional website.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's the reality. Let me just go back to one of the things about my experience of Poland. I went there in '79 when I was living in Germany, and I visited my cousins. I went back to make some documentaries in 2002, and then I went again 2 years ago to make more documentaries and programs for EWTN on our new Polish section. And I could see with my own eyes, under the socialist communist system, it was like walking into a black and white gray television set. In 2002, it was like walking into a color television set. All of a sudden, Krakow was alive, and it was colorful. And it was so striking after my first experience. And then 2 years ago, it was like walking into high-def television, and the place is hopping. People are prospering, the economy is jumping, and you see that difference lived out in that circumstance, and it's really remarkable. But when you come to our own country, in a certain sense, we've had a lot of people who, for a variety of reasons, have been on government assistance, sometimes for 3-4 generations now, since the end of World War II, especially people of color, and that they've been on government assistance, and they can never really prosper. They never are able to move. It's not, the kind of abject poverty of the Great Depression. It's not the abject poverty of places like South America. but you can never go beyond a certain level either. It stamps down development. And it's only when people get off of the state support that they can begin to flourish and do extremely well and become middle class. And I think this is something within our own system we have to take a look at. The folks who stay on government assistance and those who get out of that. Dr. Carson would be an example. Educated, brilliant man, and he moves way beyond where he was as a kid on government assistance in the projects. So why do people not look at that American experience or the experience of Eastern Europe to see the limits of socialism?
Yeah, well, I'll add a few thoughts in here for that. First, it's important for people to understand another misconception people have about socialism is they think social welfare is socialism. So governments can provide food stamps, entitlement programs. That does not transform your economy into a socialist one. So food stamps would be social welfare. The government owning the factories that make food and the supermarkets and the government setting the prices arbitrarily, that would be socialism, which has led to empty supermarket shelves in places like Venezuela.
Good distinction.
Yeah, so it's important for people to see that, and people can reasonably disagree about how to apply those social welfare programs. Though Pope St. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus did caution about the growth of the welfare state becoming too large and becoming bureaucratic and inefficient, not helping people meet their needs. When it comes to helping people, from my experience, leaving government assistance to become financially independent, some people have a stereotype, and it's an ugly one, that people are only on government assistance because they're lazy or they don't want to work hard, or they're things like that. But actually, in many cases, people who are on government assistance, they're making the most rational decision they can because they can receive more income through government assistance than they could through a comparable job that is available to them at that moment. Or if they do things to try to benefit themselves, such as getting married or pursuing other part-time work, they're kind of punished in that regard. So I remember once, Father, a volunteer at a pregnancy resource center. She almost threw in the towel when she would go and help women with unintended pregnancies, help not choose abortion but to choose life. And she was helping these women through their economic problems. And she realized that some of these women, they made more money than she did through the various government assistance programs that they were on. And she felt just very disenchanted by seeing that. So it's something to definitely consider.
Yeah. Now, we need to take a break right now. I want to come back to this because one of the things that we see in our own country is the question of, should we become socialist or should we increase government assistance on lots of programs? I'd like to discuss some of that. Again, the book we're discussing is called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? Brackets. The answer is no, and here's why. It's by Trent Horn and Catherine Pakaluk. We'll be back in just a couple minutes and let you know more about that and these important issues we must understand from a Catholic moral theology perspective. Please stay with us. All right, welcome back. We are with Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, who is a professor at the Bush School of Economics at Catholic University, and Trent Horn, who's an apologist at the Great Catholic Answers in San Diego. He's also a teacher at Holy Apostles Seminary. And we're talking about their new book, a wonderful book. I really urge you to get it. It's called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? Brackets, here the answer is no. Here's why. Again, you can get this at EWTNRC.com, or our religious catalog, and it is item number 1629. 1629. It's good for us to have, so all of us, even if you still like socialism, to have this kind of resource for helping us to think through the various elements. And as Catholic thinkers, apart from party politics and power politics related to political parties, we have to think of this in other terms than party affiliation and such. And that's why I like this. It's not, I don't find that this is a partisan issue. We were talking a little bit about how there's a difference between socialism and the social programs run by the state. Again, real quickly, would one of you like just to summarize that difference between a socialist system and the way that various governments have government programs for various kinds of financial assistance?
Sure. So socialism would involve the community, or usually the state, owning the means of production, owning factories, owning entire industries, setting prices for goods and services, and then allocating wealth and income based on how it sees it should be allocated. But social welfare would be when the government provides resources for the public to be able to use, or parts of the public. So people who say that well, to give you an example, both the United States and the Soviet Union had public hospitals, public parks, public roads, public schools, but they were obviously both not socialist countries. And the analogy I gave earlier before the break was that social welfare would be giving some members of the population food stamps or funds to purchase food. Socialism would be if the government owned the factories that made the food and the stores that sold the food and set the prices according to their central planning. So socialism is something no Catholic can support. Social welfare is something people can have reasonable disagreements about, and about the extent of those programs and which kind are most beneficial.
Now, one of the questions that comes from that, especially in some of the research that you include in your book, is that some people in our culture are saying in fairly high numbers that they like socialism, but in even higher numbers, they admire people that are entrepreneurs who are having their own businesses. What's going on there in the way that people are thinking, that they say they like socialism, but they like business people even more? How does that go together?
As we quote in the book, one Atlantic writer puts it this way: people want the government to fix everything, but not run anything. So basically, people don't know what they want. They don't know how the world works, and they want it a certain way, but don't know how to get there.
Catherine, as an economist, what would you say about that?
I would agree. I mean, call it ignorance or fantasy. I mean, actually, now that we say fantasy, we should remember that Pope Leo used the language of fiction. He said that people who want socialism just believe in fantasy, unreality. So, I mean, unreality is something that isn't going away, or the interest in embracing a kind of fantasy world isn't going away, right? It's part of our sinful nature.
And in fact, in our economy, one of the biggest sources for employment comes from small businesses rather than from large ones. Is that still true?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And so it would seem then that people don't mind working for small businesses and that a lot of people want to have their own small business. I don't think they want the government to run their store.
And we have to remember
No.
every large business started as a small business too.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that people would like there to be this wonderful world in which entrepreneurs produce things. And then when there's lots of surplus, we can kind of spread the wealth around. Remember that phrase from the Obama election cycle, just spread it around. But they are, again, unrealistic or ignorant of how those incentives for people to create value operate. So although Trent's been very clear and I think quite good about describing the distinction between a socialist country and one that has generous social welfare programs, the reason this is contentious is because everyone understands that there is a limit towards which the amount of social spreading the wealth around we can do can be done. That is a limit to that before we really start to eat away at entrepreneurs' incentives to create wealth. Kind of fighting the hand.
One of the other things that I sense, just from listening to various folks, young in particular, but others as well, older folks as well, is that people are really nervous, if not to say at times, outright afraid that they will fail at business, and they want the government to ensure that they won't fail. And so that shows up as well as in the education that they're getting. They want to be able to get an education to ensure success. But when they realize that the education they received may not have prepared them for high-paying jobs, by which they are able to pay back the money they owe for their tuition. And they're fearing economic failure in regard to their education and work opportunities. And that in the face of that fear of failure, they want the government to jump in to help prevent that failure from happening. That seems part of what I see as the attraction of what they're calling socialism, but it's probably government welfare programs they're interested in.
Well, the problem is, one way to define economics is that economics is the allocation of scarce resources to satisfy unlimited demand. So people always want and want and want, and there's only a finite amount of resources, a scarce amount of resources to satisfy that demand. So how do you allocate them? Well, when risk is present, that helps to keep those scarce resources from being over-allocated and lead to shortages. So the problem is that, we have like a scarce amount of capital to invest in businesses. And so when people have that, when people refrain from starting businesses that are foolhardy or reckless, or there's a good chance they're going to fail, well, then that reserves capital and resources for things that are more likely to succeed. It preserves those scarce resources for the enterprises that are going to be most fruitful. But when you have an entity like government that enters the picture and takes away risk, you've now taken away a smart way to allocate things, and that leads to those kind of shortages. The same things happens to education, whereas previously, if you were going to give a college student a loan as a investor or a banker, you would have to say, what is the probability this student will pay me back? And if they're going to study something that has no real world value, then you'd be hesitant to want to give them that loan. But now if all loans are guaranteed, investors have no reason to worry about risk. They know that they will get paid back anyways, but that leads to further economic problems. So that's why socialism fails to see that risk and failure is something that actually helps to maintain economic equilibrium. And God, ultimately, we have to trust in him, that how he guides us, and sometimes he allows us to fail so that we can pursue a kind of greater good he has in store for us that we didn't envision at first.
Catherine, do you have any other comments on those areas?
No, I think Trent put that very well. One thing I would add is that people often consider this posture that we have, which I think the church has, as something kind of anti-government. Sounds like, Trent has said a bunch of things about how we don't want the government to do this or that. And it's something that popes frequently say. It's not because we're against government. It's because we want to save the government. In a certain sense, the government is its own scarce resource. We want to save it strong and healthy to do the things that only the government can do.
There are some things such as public safety, also in the an impartial judiciary, and a number of other very important areas where the government ought to have expertise, and we want them to run it, whether it's international safety with diplomacy and when necessary the military, or whether it's local safety with well-run, honest government on the local level, as well as police enforcement and such. Those should be their areas of expertise, but we see that there is a great increase of the government in other areas of the economy, and sometimes some regulations, et cetera, and some rules. I remember one of the craziest laws I ever heard of in my life came, I think, in 2009 or 10, when Congress passed a law that if you grow vegetables and fruit in your home garden, you are not allowed to give it to anybody except members of your family. You may not give it to your neighbors. I said, why would the federal government make such a law? That's going beyond what they seem to understand or are competent to handle. And so it's that kind of thing where we want them to do what they should do well and let other parts of society take care of themselves. Would that be a fair analysis?
Yes, and that factors into a point we make in our book, that one of the other problems with socialism is the principle of subsidiarity. That this is a cornerstone of Catholic teaching, saying that problems and issues should be addressed at a local or smaller or lower level of organization before one goes up the ladder, so to speak. That's why if you have a problem at your parish, you don't email the Pope for help.
Right.
You have to, you go through that, because otherwise trying to go things at a higher level first leads to inefficiencies and is not conducive to the common good. And the example you give about dealing with growing produce in someone's neighborhood is not necessarily something that Washington is best to handle. One ought to keep things at the principle of subsidiarity at the levels that are most appropriate.
Yeah, I know. I only heard of one person being prosecuted under that law. It was a little old lady outside of Cleveland, and the police had to come in and plow under her garden. That seems crazy, to me, but and I will admit, I have taken vegetables from my parishioners and eaten them. Gratefully, I might add.
What a rogue.
But this is something that, again, we want people to think about in terms of their own understanding of their relationship to the economy and the government. These issues are not un-Christian concerns. It's not as if we can say that the church has no business thinking about business or government. Just say Mass, and that's it. And here are confessions if we get caught defrauding the government or the businesses. No, the church has a real concern. And as I recall, 100 years before Adam Smith wrote his book on that is the basis of capitalism, it was Jesuit and Dominican priests in Spain who laid out the basic principles of capitalism as a way to regulate the economy. And the church has that kind of concern with these issues from very early on.
It was a perennial biblical command to care for the poor, going all the way back to Deuteronomy 15. The Lord said, "There shall not be the poor in your land." Jesus said in Matthew 25 to feed the hungry, to care for the least among us. So clearly, combating poverty is a Christian concern. And what's ironic is that some people claim Christians are not being Christians for failing to support socialism. Actually, Christians are carrying out their Christian duty towards the poor by opposing socialism, because socialism ultimately leads to miserable and fatal levels of poverty. And that's something we document well in our book over and over and over again. And that in the modern era, we have and that's what Popes Leo XIII and Pius XI and others were getting at. We have an unprecedented way to be able to care for the poor now that there is so much surplus wealth, but we ought to use prudence in accord with, as Pope Leo says, with principles of right reason to be able to do that.
Yeah, and just real briefly, we have only a couple minutes left, but just so folks understand something that they should investigate. What were some of the socialist experiments in economics that failed, and what should we learn from them in, say, 2 minutes, if you can?
Catherine, would you like this, or would you like me to?
Well, I think that we could just look at Venezuela now, because many of your listeners, or our listeners today, will remember what Venezuela was like when it was not ravaged by socialist policies, when it was a prosperous nation, where they had cultural accomplishments that were the pride of the area. So I think that's one in recent memory, but we know Cuba, Russia, the Soviet Union, China, the Ukraine.
Yeah,
and we can think of Nazi Germany as well.
And India, certainly has done better under increased capitalism than its socialist experiments.
Right, and China is another good example of this, that when it was under communist control in the 50s and 60s, that led to the worst famine in the history of the world. It killed 30 million people. Is the worst disaster in the history of the world. But then China's economics improved, and people only began to be lifted out of poverty when China embraced a limited free market economic principles in the 1980s. So when you look at everything across the board on any available metric, socialism fails. And that's why we're always amazed that socialism is the idea that's always allowed to be proposed no matter how many times it fails. And capitalism is the idea you're never allowed to propose no matter how many times it succeeds. But we believe the data from the empirical sciences, from economics, as well as from philosophy and what we've learned from magisterial teaching show that, as Pope Pius XI said, no good Catholic can be a true socialist.
All right, the book is called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? Brackets, the answer is no, and here's why. Again, by Trent Horn and Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. Get it at EWTNRC.com. It's item 1629. I strongly urge you to look at this carefully and pursue some of that research. Thank you both for being with us, and may the Lord bless all of you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And just want to remind you, in these days, we still need your support. We've been delighted to be able to offer Mass and Rosary and all the other prayers, but we need you to keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill so we can pay our bills too. God bless you all. Thank you.